The US government shutdown is about to enter its second week, still with no sign of a breakthrough. Republicans and Democrats are refusing to compromise over their budget impasse, and the situation is growing more tense with a looming deadline for a bigger economic issue, the need to lift the US debt ceiling. To explain what that is and why it could rattle the global economy, I was joined earlier from Washington by Justin Wolfers, one of the best-known Australian economists in the world. He's currently a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan. Professor Wolfers, firstly, the million-dollar question, or perhaps the multi-billion-dollar question. How much longer will this government shutdown keep going in the US?
Well, no one's very optimistic that they see a solution around the corner. There's really no emphasis on getting a deal done from either side of politics right now. The real ticking time bomb is the debt ceiling, which I think most economists are even more worried about, and that's due to expire mid to late October.
I'll come back to the debt ceiling shortly, but before that, we know economic indicators lag, of course, but is there any sense yet of how the shutdown is affecting the US economy, especially given that it's been in recovery mode?
Yeah, there's actually one very good economic indicator that we do have since the shutdown. Gallup does daily surveys of consumer confidence in the United States, and so the most recent readings we have are for the 3 or 4 days since the shutdown began. And you've seen consumer confidence just absolutely plummet. So it's clear that people aren't confident, that they are worried this is going to have an effect on the economy, and it's already having an effect. The real economic indicators, the stuff we actually care about, employment and unemployment and gross domestic product and stuff like that, it's going to be another month or two until we get a serious reading on this. But at the very least, we know that there's nothing good coming out of this.
You're in Washington, D.C. Is the effect of the shutdown noticeable on everyday life?
It's absolutely noticeable. This, of course, is the Canberra of the United States, so there are public servants everywhere. They now know they're going to get paid for being furloughed right now. So many of my friends in the public sector, honestly, are off to IKEA, and they're off to IKEA knowing that they'll get paid while they're there. But more than that, you see a real tension through the streets of Washington. I think you see people on both the left and the right with furrowed brows, shaking their heads, really quite unable to believe just how bad the situation is. And more than that, it really is a city that as a whole I think is really on edge, and you get things, not just the politics here, but you know, there was shootings at the Naval Yard, there's some clown threw fireworks over the White House fence the other day, there was a woman who got shot trying to enter the White House and then later the Capitol. There was a man who self-immolated on the National Mall. It just has every feeling of a city right on the edge.
You mentioned the debt ceiling earlier. Can you please briefly and simply explain for our audience what that is and why the 17th of October deadline is so significant?
Yeah, so the debt ceiling, first of all, is ridiculous and redundant, but let me tell you what it is. Congress has decided how much they want to spend, and they've decided how much they want to tax. And if those two don't match exactly, then what you end up with is they have to borrow. But then they have a completely separate law that says you can't borrow more than this separate amount, called the debt ceiling. And so Congress is about to run up against its own limit. And so what this means is that the President's going to be unable to borrow in order to fulfil the very policies that Congress has passed. And so they've put the President literally in an untenable situation. He either has to not spend the money they told him to spend, or not borrow the money because they've told him not to borrow.
What would happen if the US defaulted on its debt?
There's two channels you want to think about. The first is the financial channel, which is, even if the US defaulted for just a very short period of time, US national debt is the cornerstone of the financial system. It's regarded as the risk-free asset. And so, for instance, in many financial markets, it's used as a form of collateral. Well, if the US government's defaulted, it will no longer be good collateral. And that could set in chain a financial crisis. And this is the same dynamics we saw with the global financial crisis, where I'm not willing to lend to you because I don't know if you've got exposure to a particular form of bad debt. During the financial crisis, it was mortgage-backed securities, and during this potential crisis, it would be US government debt. Now, there's a second channel. If you hit the debt ceiling, then you can't borrow any more money, which means you've got to bring the budget deficit down to zero immediately. It's currently 4% of GDP. So this would cause a huge fiscal contraction if the debt ceiling limit wasn't raised for a persistent period. Big enough that I can be absolutely confident it would plunge the US into recession.
As you mentioned, there's been a long-standing assumption underpinning the world's financial system, which is that US government debt is risk-free. Is that still a valid assumption?
Not in my eyes. It's funny, just about every American economist will tell you absolutely it is. Of course, the last time we monkeyed around with the debt ceiling, it led Standard & Poor's to downgrade the US from AAA. And the fact that you see the US Congress willing to play these games, and one major political party, the Republicans, willing to threaten to default, and actually many of the fringe wing of that Republican Party claiming it wouldn't be so bad, it doesn't give you any confidence. I think, realistically what's happening is they're playing chicken. The problem is you don't want to play chicken because sometimes you drive the car off the end of the cliff, and there's some chance that'll happen, and that is a real risk. And I do think there's an enormously greater chance, for instance, that the US one day will default than, say, a country like Australia.
Professor Wolfers, thanks for your time today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Leigh.